The sound of hooves pounding against the dry earth echoed through the vast, empty landscape of the frontier. It was the middle of the day, but the sun's unforgiving heat made the air shimmer with waves of heat. The prairie, usually so quiet, now held the promise of something darker, something dangerous. From the top of a steep hill, a group of outlaws watched a modest ranch nestled below. A man in a wide-brimmed hat, the leader of this gang, wiped his brow and narrowed his eyes. "That's the place," he muttered under his breath, staring down at the ranch with a wicked grin spreading across his face. His gang wasn't a group to be underestimated. They had terrorized the region for years, their names whispered in fear around campfires and in saloons. But today wasn't about robbing a bank or rustling cattle. Today, they had a different plan, a more personal one. Their eyes were set on something far more valuable than gold or silver, a woman. Her name was Abigail Wright, the wife of one of the wealthiest ranchers in the area, Thomas Wright. She was known across the county for her beauty, her strength, and, most notably, her reputation as a crack shot. A woman whose name had a history of causing trouble for anyone foolish enough to cross her. But the outlaws didn't care about her reputation, or about what she had done in the past. All they saw was an opportunity to strike, a chance to kidnap her and hold her for ransom. But what they didn't know, what they couldn't possibly have known, was that they had just made a terrible mistake. The gang rode down to the ranch, kicking up clouds of dust. The ranch house was quiet, the only sound the occasional clink of a horseshoe against stone. As they approached the front porch, one of the outlaws sneered. "Let's make this quick," he said, reaching for his gun. But just as he took a step forward, a shadow appeared from behind the barn. Then, a flash of light. Before anyone could react, the outlaw fell, a bullet whizzing past his ear, barely missing him. The gang froze. The shadow moved again, this time more deliberately. From behind the barn emerged a woman, her face hidden beneath the brim of a wide, dusty hat. She was tall, confident, her stance solid and unwavering. The outlaws' eyes widened in surprise as they realized that the ranch wasn't as defenseless as they had thought. "You boys sure you want to do this?" The voice was calm, but it held an edge, a warning. And in that moment, the outlaws felt it, the unmistakable presence of someone who knew exactly how to handle a gun. Abigail Wright was not just any rancher's wife. She was known far and wide as one of the most feared gunslingers in the West. And the outlaws had just made the gravest error of their lives. Her reputation had spread across the territories like wildfire. Stories about her marksmanship were legendary. People had seen her take down a wild boar from over 100 yards away. She could shoot a dime tossed in the air, splitting it in half with a single shot. Many of the men who had challenged her over the years had learned the hard way: Abigail Wright didn't lose. She didn't just survive, she thrived in the chaos of the frontier. And yet, none of that mattered to the gang that had come to take her hostage. They thought they could overpower her. They thought that by grabbing her and taking her to the hills, they would get a hefty ransom from her husband. But they had no idea just how badly they had misjudged the situation. Abigail didn't flinch as the gang started to draw their weapons. Her hand moved slowly to the holster at her side, fingers brushing against the handle of her revolver, as if the gun had always been a part of her. Her eyes never left the outlaws as she stepped forward, one measured step at a time. "You've made a mistake," she said, her voice soft but carrying the weight of 1,000 storms. "And now, you'll have to live with it." The leader of the outlaws sneered. "We're not afraid of a woman," he spat, his hand hovering over the grip of his pistol. But Abigail's eyes had already locked onto him, and he knew, deep down, that this was no ordinary woman. In a flash, it happened. The gunfire rang out, sharp and piercing, faster than anyone could comprehend. One outlaw fell to the ground, clutching his chest. Then another. And another. The gang had no time to react. They were outmatched, outclassed, and utterly caught off guard. But there was one outlaw still standing, his hand trembling around the hilt of his gun. He wasn't ready to die, not like this. With a desperate move, he lunged toward Abigail, hoping to take her down in a final act of defiance. But Abigail was faster. With a fluid, practiced motion, she drew her gun, aimed, and fired. The outlaw never stood a chance. He crumpled to the ground, his body hitting the earth with a soft thud. Silence followed, broken only by the wind and the distant call of a hawk. Abigail stood tall, her revolver still smoking in her hand. The remaining outlaws, now completely unnerved, stumbled backward. Their plan had failed, and they were staring down the barrel of one of the deadliest women in the West. Abigail didn't say another word. She didn't need to. Her message was clear, they were out of their league. But as the last outlaw tried to run, a voice called out from the shadows. A figure stepped forward from the tree line, his face hidden by the shadows of his own wide-brimmed hat. His voice was low and calm, but it carried a threat that made the remaining outlaws freeze in place. "Hold up there," the man said, his tone cold and unyielding. It wasn't just any voice. It was Thomas Wright, Abigail's husband. And that's where our story truly begins. The tension in the air was thick as the two powerful figures, Abigail and Thomas, faced the gang and the men who had dared to kidnap her. But with their arrival came more questions than answers. Why was Thomas here? Was this an alliance, or had the rancher come to rescue his wife from her own fight? The outlaws, trapped between Abigail's unyielding strength and Thomas's mysterious arrival, realized too late that this was a battle they couldn't win. But they didn't know how deep the story went, how tangled the threads were between Abigail, Thomas, and a world far darker than they had ever imagined. What had they walked into? And would they survive to regret it? Or was this just the beginning of something much, much worse? The clock was ticking, and their fates were sealed in a way they couldn't yet comprehend. To find out what happens next, stay tuned. The dust from the gunfight still hung heavy in the air, swirling around like the ghosts of the fallen outlaws. But the danger wasn't over, not by a long shot. As the last outlaw collapsed, Abigail stood still, her breath steady, her eyes scanning the area. The wind began to pick up, carrying the distant sounds of rattlesnakes and hawks. The stillness of the moment felt like an eerie calm before the storm. Thomas Wright, her husband, stepped into the clearing, his boots crunching softly against the dry grass. He was a tall, broad-shouldered man, with eyes that held the weight of years spent in the unforgiving world of cattle ranching and hard choices. His face was weathered, a testament to the relentless sun and the life he had led. But his presence was undeniable, and it sent a silent message to the remaining outlaws. The outlaws, huddling together now, had no idea how to respond. They had come expecting an easy target. They had thought that kidnapping Abigail would be their ticket to a big payday, a foolproof plan that would make them legends among their peers. But now, in the face of Abigail's unmatched skill and Thomas's looming presence, they saw that they had walked straight into a trap they couldn't escape. One of the outlaws, the youngest of the bunch, was the first to speak. His voice trembled, and his hands shook as he gripped his rifle. We didn't know she was like that," he muttered, more to himself than to anyone else. "We were just following orders." Abigail's gaze never left him. She didn't flinch, didn't show an ounce of mercy. "You made a choice," she said coldly, her voice steady. "And now you have to live with it." The tension between the two groups was thick, like the calm before the storm. The outlaws, realizing they had no way out, started shifting uneasily, knowing they were cornered. But it was the arrival of Thomas that made the air feel even more charged. His presence, calm and composed, added an unspoken layer of intensity to the situation. "Abigail," Thomas said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of a man who had seen too many years of hardship. "Are you all right?" Abigail didn't look at him immediately. Her eyes were still locked on the outlaws, and for a moment, it seemed like she was still weighing the consequences of what had just happened. But then, her gaze softened ever so slightly. "I'm fine, Thomas. You don't need to worry about me." There was something more in her voice, something unspoken between them. It wasn't just concern or relief, it was the silent understanding of two people who had been through hell and back together. And it was clear that whatever had drawn them to this moment, it wasn't just a matter of life and death. It was a matter of something deeper, something that neither of them could escape. As Thomas stepped forward, his eyes scanned the outlaws, who were now beginning to back away in fear. He stood tall, every inch a man of the land, and yet there was something more to him. Abigail knew it as well as she knew her own reflection in a mirror. Thomas Wright was not the simple rancher that everyone thought he was. He was someone with his own secrets, with a past that was as dark and complicated as the land they lived on. And those secrets were about to come to light. The leader of the outlaws, his face pale and sweat-streaked, glanced nervously at Thomas. "We didn't know about her," he muttered, his voice breaking. "We didn't know who we were messing with. Please, don't kill us. We were just after the money." Thomas took a slow, deliberate step toward the leader, his eyes narrowing. "You think this is about money?" he asked, his tone darkening. "You think it's all about the money?" The outlaw leader froze, unsure of what to say. He had thought Thomas was just another rancher, someone easy to intimidate, someone who wouldn't dare step into the chaos of the outlaw world. But now, standing face to face with him, the man realized how wrong he had been. Thomas wasn't just a rancher. He was a force to be reckoned with. "You've made the mistake of thinking this is about a ransom," Thomas continued, his voice low and controlled. "You've made the mistake of thinking you could take what's mine and get away with it. And now, you're going to pay the price." Abigail moved slightly behind him, her hand resting on the grip of her revolver, her eyes never leaving the outlaws. She wasn't about to let anyone take control of this situation. Not now. Not ever. The outlaws exchanged nervous glances, realizing that they had nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. Their only option now was to beg, to plead for their lives. But Abigail had already made up her mind. She wasn't going to let them walk away after what they had done. Not after they had tried to take her, and worse, underestimated her. "You're not going anywhere," she said flatly, her voice carrying a cold edge. "You're going to face the consequences of your actions. All of you." But just as the last of the outlaws seemed to accept their fate, there was a sudden shift in the air. A rustling sound from the nearby trees caught everyone's attention, and for a brief moment, the tension in the clearing seemed to dissipate. A rider emerged from the shadows, his silhouette dark against the setting sun. His horse moved with precision, like a shadow in the dusk, and his face remained obscured beneath the brim of his hat. The outlaws, already on edge, froze once more, unsure of who this new figure was. Abigail and Thomas both turned to face the rider. There was something unsettling about the man, something familiar in the way he moved. And yet, neither of them could place him. "Who are you?" Thomas asked, his voice tight with suspicion. The rider didn't respond immediately. Instead, he dismounted slowly, his boots hitting the ground with a soft thud. He pulled his hat back slightly, revealing his face, a man with sharp features, piercing blue eyes, and a scar running down the side of his face. "I'm the one you've been looking for," the man said, his voice gravelly and calm. Abigail's heart skipped a beat. She had heard that voice before. But before she could say anything, the man reached into his coat and pulled out a letter. "This," he said, holding it out to Thomas, "is for you. It's about your wife." Thomas reached for the letter, his eyes scanning the mysterious man. The tension between them was palpable, and Abigail could feel the weight of it. This wasn't just some ordinary encounter. This was the beginning of something much larger. What had Thomas gotten himself, and Abigail, into? And more importantly, what did this mysterious man know about Abigail's past that no one else did? The answer to these questions would change everything. But for now, all they could do was wait. The cliffhanger was unbearable, as the letter in Thomas's hand felt like it could reveal the truth that had been buried for far too long. The real question was, would they be ready for what came next? Thomas stood still, holding the letter in his hand, his eyes locked on the mysterious man before him. The writer's presence was unsettling, like a shadow in the corner of the room, always lurking. Abigail had already reached for the holster of her revolver once more, her instincts telling her that this man wasn't here to offer them help. He was here to make things even more complicated. The man's scarred face remained expressionless as he waited, his piercing blue eyes never leaving Thomas. His horse stood quietly behind him, the only sound in the clearing now the rustling of the wind against the tall grass. Abigail could feel the tension in the air, thick, almost suffocating. Thomas, for all his calm composure, was still holding the letter in his hand, clearly reluctant to open it. "What is this?" Thomas finally asked, his voice measured, his grip tightening on the letter. "Who sent you?" The writer didn't answer right away. He only stepped closer, his boots silent on the earth, as though he were sizing up Thomas. It was the kind of look that made Abigail's skin crawl, like this man knew things about them that even they didn't understand. She could feel the fear creeping up her spine, though she tried to push it down. Fear wasn't something she allowed herself to show, not even now. "You know exactly who I am, Thomas," the man said finally, his voice calm but carrying a weight that made the air feel even heavier. "And you know who sent me. The question is, do you really want to know the truth?" Thomas's eyes narrowed. "I've had enough of games." Abigail stepped forward then, placing a firm hand on Thomas's arm. "Don't listen to him, Thomas. We don't need his truth. We've been living with our own just fine." The writer's eyes flicked toward Abigail, an amused glint in his cold stare. "Oh, I think you've been living with half-truths. And you both know it." Thomas didn't flinch, but Abigail could see the muscles in his jaw tighten. She knew something was wrong. She could feel it in her bones. There was a part of Thomas's past he hadn't shared with her. A part she had always suspected, but never fully understood. And now, standing in front of them, was a man who seemed to know more about it than either of them did. "Who are you?" Abigail asked, her voice steady but sharp. "Why should we trust anything you have to say?" The writer smiled, but it wasn't a reassuring smile. It was the kind of smile that made you wonder just how much darkness lay beneath the surface. He glanced down at the letter, still held tightly in Thomas's hand, and then back at the couple before him. "You really don't get it, do you?" he said. "This isn't just about you, Thomas. This is about something much bigger. You've been playing a game you don't even understand. And you've been lying to her." The words hung in the air like smoke. Abigail felt her chest tighten, her heart pounding. She glanced at Thomas, his face unreadable. For a moment, she thought he might say something, might explain himself, but he stayed silent, still clutching the letter in his hand as if it were a lifeline. The writer took a step closer, his boots crunching softly against the dry earth. "There's more going on here than you know, Abigail. More than you've ever known. But Thomas? He's kept you in the dark on purpose. Because the truth is dangerous." Abigail felt a wave of anger rise in her chest. "Stop talking in riddles," she snapped. "If you know something, say it plainly." The writer tilted his head slightly, as if contemplating her words. "You think you've got it all figured out, don't you? You think you know your husband. But Abigail, there's a whole world you haven't seen. And the man you're married to? He's not the simple rancher you think he is. He's not even close. Abigail felt a chill run through her. She'd always known there was more to Thomas than met the eye, but hearing these words out loud, from someone who seemed to know so much, made her world shift beneath her feet. Enough, Thomas finally spoke, his voice low but commanding. He unfolded the letter in his hand, his fingers trembling slightly as he did. Abigail's breath caught in her throat as he began to read. The writer didn't move, didn't make a sound, but his eyes never left Thomas's face. Abigail watched the emotions flicker across Thomas's expression as he read. At first, there was nothing, just the same stoic face she'd come to know. But then, slowly, his eyes darkened, and a shift happened, something familiar, something she hadn't seen in years. "What does it say?" Abigail asked, her voice barely above a whisper. She didn't want to hear it, but she knew she had to. There was no escaping the truth now, whatever it was. Thomas folded the letter back up with a snap, his jaw tightening. "It's from someone I used to know," he said, his voice low. "Someone I thought I had left behind." Abigail felt a pang in her chest. There was no mistaking it now. Whatever was in that letter was something that would change everything. "Who?" she asked, though she was afraid to hear the answer. The writer's smile returned, but it wasn't comforting. It was a grim, knowing smile. "Someone who has been watching you, Thomas. Someone who has been waiting. And now they've found you." Thomas shook his head, almost as if trying to shake off the weight of the words. "It's not possible. They're supposed to be gone. All of them." The writer let out a soft chuckle, a sound devoid of any warmth. "You think you're safe here? Out in the middle of nowhere? You think they've forgotten about you?" Abigail's heart pounded in her chest. "What do you mean, they? Who are you talking about?" The writer's eyes flicked toward her. "There's a name you'll need to remember, Abigail. The Blackthorn Syndicate. That's who's been pulling the strings. That's who your husband used to run with." Thomas stiffened beside her, his body going rigid as if struck by lightning. The name echoed in Abigail's mind, and for a moment, she couldn't breathe. The Blackthorn Syndicate. A name whispered in the darkest corners of the West. A criminal organization so ruthless, so dangerous, that even the most hardened outlaws feared crossing them. They were the stuff of nightmares, the shadow in every town, every saloon. And now, it seemed, they had resurfaced, with a vengeance. Abigail turned to Thomas, her eyes wide with disbelief. "What is he talking about, Thomas?" she demanded, her voice shaking. "What is this? What have you gotten us into?" Thomas didn't answer right away. His silence spoke volumes. And in that silence, Abigail realized something she hadn't wanted to admit. Thomas wasn't just a rancher. He wasn't just her husband. He had been a part of something far darker, something she had never known. And now, the past was coming for them. And it wasn't letting go. The writer nodded slowly, a grim look crossing his face. "You should have known, Abigail. You should have known the man you married." Abigail's heart pounded louder in her chest, each beat echoing the growing realization that everything she thought she knew was a lie. She had married Thomas because of the man he presented himself to be, a simple, hard-working rancher, someone who had left his past behind him. But now, standing in front of her, was a man who seemed to know more about her husband than she did. And with each word, the world she'd built with Thomas began to unravel. Her gaze flicked toward Thomas, searching for an explanation, but his eyes were downcast, his expression unreadable. He hadn't said a word, hadn't tried to defend himself, hadn't explained a thing. It was as if the weight of the writer's words had struck him dumb, leaving him paralyzed with guilt or shame, she couldn't tell which. The writer, sensing the shift in the air, let out a soft, almost pitying laugh. You think you can run from the past, Thomas? You think you can bury it and pretend it's all gone? His voice was laced with a dark amusement, and the way he spoke made Abigail's stomach twist. She took a step closer to Thomas, her eyes narrowing at the man. "What do you want from us?" she asked, her voice colder than she intended, but the fear she felt bubbling beneath the surface pushed her to speak with a strength she didn't quite feel. The writer's smile faded, replaced by a hard, cold look. "I don't want anything from you, Abigail," he said. "I'm just the messenger. The Blackthorn Syndicate, they're the ones who want something. And trust me, when they come calling, it's never good." Abigail glanced at Thomas, her mind racing. The Blackthorn Syndicate. The name sent chills down her spine. Stories of their cruelty had haunted the West for years, powerful men who controlled everything from the banks to the saloons, and who would stop at nothing to get what they wanted. No one, not even the most feared outlaws, dared to cross them. And now, it seemed, they were tangled up in their lives. "Thomas," Abigail whispered, her voice cracking. "What is this? What did you do?" Thomas's shoulders slumped, and for the first time since this man had appeared, Abigail saw the weight of regret in his eyes. It's not like that," he began, his voice barely audible. "I didn't choose them, Abigail. I thought I was out. I thought I was free." The writer laughed, the sound harsh and bitter. "You can't escape the Blackthorn Syndicate, Thomas. No one does. You can run, you can hide, but they always find you. And now they've found you, and your wife." Abigail's stomach turned. She didn't want to believe it, didn't want to admit that everything Thomas had told her might have been a lie. But the reality was setting in, slowly but surely, like a storm gathering on the horizon. This wasn't some random encounter. This was the past coming back to claim what it was owed. And they were in the middle of it. "Why now?" Abigail demanded, her voice rising. "Why are they coming for us now? After all these years?" The writer's eyes flickered with something dark, a knowing glint that made her skin crawl. "Because of you, Abigail," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "You're the reason they're here." Abigail recoiled, feeling as if the ground had just been ripped from beneath her feet. "What are you talking about?" she asked, her voice trembling now. The writer didn't answer immediately. Instead, he seemed to savor the moment, watching her carefully, as if waiting for the full weight of his words to sink in. "You think you're just a rancher's wife, don't you? That you're just some innocent bystander in all this?" He paused, his lips curling into a smirk. "But that's not who you are. That's not who you've ever been." Thomas shifted uncomfortably beside her, his hand gripping his rifle in a white-knuckled grasp. He opened his mouth to speak, but the writer cut him off. "Don't try to protect her, Thomas," the writer sneered. "She's a part of this too. She always has been." Abigail turned to Thomas, her eyes wide with disbelief. "What does he mean? What is he talking about?" she demanded, her heart racing. For the first time since the writer had arrived, Thomas finally spoke, his voice quiet but full of regret. "Abigail, there's something I've never told you. Something I should have told you before. I wasn't always just a rancher. Before all of this, I was a part of the syndicate, too." Abigail's breath caught in her throat, and for a long moment, the world around her seemed to spin. She wanted to say something, to demand answers, but the words wouldn't come. Her mind was racing, her thoughts a blur of confusion and disbelief. Thomas had been part of the syndicate? The same people who had been terrorizing the West for decades? "But I left," Thomas continued, his voice shaking with the weight of his confession. "I swore I was done with them. I built this life with you, Abigail. This life wasn't supposed to be connected to that past. But the syndicate, they don't let you go so easily. Abigail took a step back, her eyes locking with his. How could you not tell me this, Thomas? How could you hide something like that from me? Thomas closed his eyes, his face twisted in guilt. I didn't want to lose you, he said simply. I thought if I kept it hidden, I could protect you. But I was wrong. I should have told you everything. Abigail didn't know what to think. Her mind was reeling. She had married a man who had a past as dark and dangerous as the men who had kidnapped her. But this wasn't just about Thomas anymore. It was about them. It was about her. And the syndicate had come for both of them. The writer stepped closer, his eyes gleaming with cruel satisfaction. You think you're in control here? You think you can still walk away from all of this? He asked, his voice dripping with mockery. The syndicate doesn't let people go. You're not getting out of this, Thomas. And neither is she. The words hung heavy in the air, like a death sentence that had already been written. Abigail felt her knees go weak. She had no idea what to do next, no idea how to escape the danger that now surrounded them. The past had found them, and it was more ruthless than she could ever have imagined. Abigail reached for Thomas's hand, her fingers trembling. The look in his eyes was a mixture of fear and regret, but also something else. Something darker. We can't outrun this, he whispered, his voice breaking. Not anymore. The writer nodded, almost approvingly. No, you can't. But you can try to survive. And with that, the words lingered in the air, heavy with the weight of the future that awaited them. The past was coming for them. And no matter how hard they tried to escape, it would find them, always. Abigail's heart hammered in her chest as the weight of the writer's words sank in. The Blackthorn Syndicate, she'd heard the name whispered in taverns, in dimly lit alleyways where men spoke in hushed tones, but she never thought it would come this close. Never thought it would involve her, much less Thomas. The past that she thought was buried deep in the dust of the West was now dragging them both back, like an old ghost that refused to stay dead. She felt a wave of coldness wash over her, and for a moment, it wasn't just the writer who stood before them, but the entire weight of the syndicate itself. They were coming. No matter how far they ran, no matter how hard they fought, they'd never be far enough. The shadow of those ruthless men would stretch far and wide, and it would never let them go. But even as the fear gripped her, there was something else, a spark of defiance, a flicker of the woman she had once been before all of this. Before she became a rancher's wife, before she learned to hide away her past. She wasn't just going to stand here and let the writer dictate their fate. She wasn't going to let him twist Thomas's guilt into their own damnation. She turned her gaze back to Thomas, who still stood there, as if the weight of the world had descended upon him. His eyes, once filled with the warmth and hope of the future they had built together, now seemed clouded with the storm of his past. Abigail could see the battle raging within him, between the man he was now, and the man he once had been. She had never imagined that his past was so dark, so tangled in crime and bloodshed. Thomas. She whispered, her voice trembling, but firm. We need to fight. We can't just give up. He didn't answer right away, his gaze fixed on the ground as if trying to summon the courage to meet her eyes. After a long, unbearable silence, he finally spoke, his voice barely audible. I wish I could promise you that we could fight them and win, Abigail, he said. But the truth is, I don't know if we can. The syndicate, they're not like other men. They don't play by the rules. They have eyes everywhere. I was one of their best, Abigail. I was someone I'm not proud of. Abigail's chest tightened, but she refused to let the despair take over. She reached for his hand, squeezing it tightly. We're not running from this. We've faced things before, and we've made it through. We can do it again. Together. Thomas's fingers curled around hers, but his eyes remained distant. I thought I could keep you safe. I thought if I left it all behind, we could have a life free from all that. But the past has a way of coming back. I didn't expect it to come for you, too. Abigail's mind raced. They didn't have the luxury of time to dwell on regrets. She couldn't let Thomas drown in guilt while danger closed in on them. She had to make a decision. And fast. The rider shifted behind them, his presence like a dark cloud that refused to dissipate. You can pretend you're not in danger, he said, his tone almost condescending, but you both know the truth. The Blackthorn Syndicate will come for you, and you'll be lucky if you get out alive. Abigail turned on him, her patience finally snapping. What do you want from us? You think you've scared us enough with your threats? You think you can just waltz in here and tell us our lives are over? The rider met her glare without flinching. I'm not here to scare you, Abigail, he replied coldly. I'm here to give you a warning. You think you're out of their reach, but you're not. And neither is Thomas. You both should have known that when you decided to keep running. Her mind screamed with frustration. They couldn't keep running. They couldn't keep hiding. But the problem wasn't just about running anymore. It was about survival. It was about the truth, the terrifying, ugly truth of who Thomas had been and who the Syndicate was. Abigail felt like she was stuck between two worlds, the one she had built with Thomas, and the one that was pulling them into darkness. What do we do now? She asked, her voice shaking despite her best efforts. She didn't want to feel vulnerable, didn't want to admit how much she was drowning in this sea of uncertainty, but she needed answers. She needed to know what their next move was. The rider paused for a moment, as though considering her question, before responding. You have a choice, Abigail, he said, his voice almost casual, as though discussing the weather. You can run, and the Syndicate will eventually catch up with you. Or you can face them head-on and hope you have what it takes to survive. Abigail clenched her jaw. There was no running. Not anymore. But there was something about this man's attitude that grated on her. His calm, detached demeanor felt like a slap in the face. I didn't ask for your advice, she snapped. We'll figure this out ourselves. The rider shrugged, as if her words didn't matter. It's your life. Just don't say I didn't warn you when they come for you. With that, he turned and mounted his horse in a single, fluid motion. As he spurred the animal, he cast one last glance over his shoulder. You'll regret this, Thomas. You can't escape the past. It always catches up. And just like that, he rode off, disappearing into the vast, empty horizon, leaving only a trail of dust behind him. The silence that followed was suffocating. Abigail stood there, her body tense, her heart racing. She couldn't shake the feeling that their lives had just taken a turn they couldn't undo. Thomas let out a long breath, his shoulders slumping as if he had been holding in a weight too long. He turned to face Abigail, his eyes filled with a mixture of regret and determination. We can't let them win, Abigail. I won't let them take us down. I've made too many mistakes, but I won't make another one. Abigail didn't know what to say. She wanted to believe him, wanted to trust that they could fight this, but the odds seemed stacked against them. The Syndicate was everywhere. They had eyes and ears in every corner of the West, and now, they had their sights set on them. The question wasn't whether they could survive, it was whether they had the strength to fight back. We need to figure out a plan, Abigail said, her voice steady despite the storm raging inside her. We need to know who we're up against, where they're hiding, and what they want. I'm not just going to sit here and wait for them to come. Thomas nodded slowly. You're right. But we can't do this alone. We'll need help. Abigail's mind flickered with the possibility of allies, men and women who might stand with them against the Syndicate. But who could they trust? The West was full of outlaws, thieves, and cowards. They'd need to find people who knew the syndicate's ways, who could give them the edge they needed. And that wasn't going to be easy. But there was no turning back now. The danger was too real. The stakes were too high. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the barren land, Abigail made a vow to herself. No matter what it took, she wouldn't let the syndicate take them down. Not without a fight. The battle had only just begun. The next few days blurred together in a haze of uncertainty and tension. Abigail could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on her chest, the fear of the unknown, the constant awareness that danger lurked just beyond the horizon. The landscape around them seemed less vast and open now, as if the very land itself had become a prison. Every creak of the floorboards, every distant sound carried a weight that made her jump, her senses on high alert. Thomas was quiet, more so than usual. He spent his time tinkering with the horses and cleaning his rifle, lost in his own thoughts, as though trying to prepare for a battle that had already started but wasn't fully visible yet. His mind was always far away, back in that past he had left behind, that past Abigail had never truly known until now. She could see the internal struggle eating him alive. It wasn't just about surviving anymore. It was about redemption. If they managed to escape the syndicate, would he be able to live with himself? Would they both? Abigail wanted to reach him, to remind him that they were in this together, but the space between them felt wider every day. The trust they had built, the years of simple ranch life, had been shattered in an instant. No matter how hard she tried, she couldn't escape the gnawing feeling that there was something more, something bigger, that neither of them understood yet. One afternoon, as the sun hung low and the world seemed too quiet, Abigail decided to do something she hadn't done in years, something she never thought she would have to do again. She needed to find out more about the syndicate. She needed answers. They couldn't fight what they didn't understand. And so, without a word to Thomas, she set out toward town. The walk to the nearby settlement was longer than she remembered, each step echoing the uncertainty she felt inside. Her mind was racing with questions. Who could she trust? How could they fight an enemy they knew so little about? She had to find someone who knew the syndicate, someone who might still have some ties to the old ways. Her thoughts kept circling back to the man who had warned them, the rider. There was something off about him, something she couldn't place. Did he have his own agenda? Or was he simply a pawn in the syndicate's game? As she walked, the town slowly came into view, the familiar shape of the saloon standing at its heart. The saloon, always the center of gossip and whispers. It was a place where secrets were traded for a drink and where the line between truth and fiction was often blurred. Abigail had never particularly liked it. But tonight, it would be her best chance at finding answers. Inside, the air was thick with smoke, the clinking of glasses and the low murmur of conversation blending together. Abigail's eyes scanned the room, looking for familiar faces, men she had seen around the ranch, cowhands and traders who had no business with the syndicate, but who still heard whispers. She needed someone who could give her information without asking too many questions. It didn't take long for her to spot him, a man she had seen once or twice at the local market, a quiet figure who kept to himself. His name was Jack. He was a weathered man with a few too many scars on his face, his eyes always darting around, never staying in one place for too long. He had a reputation for knowing things that no one else would tell you unless you asked in the right way. And tonight, she had a lot of questions. She approached him cautiously, sliding into the seat next to him. Jack didn't look up immediately, but when he did, his eyes narrowed slightly, as though sizing her up. "You need something, Abigail?" he asked, his voice low and gruff. Abigail leaned in, her voice barely above a whisper. "I need to know about the Blackthorn Syndicate." The mention of the name caused Jack's expression to shift, the corners of his lips twitching as if trying to hide a knowing smile. "That's a dangerous road you're asking to walk, lady," he said, his voice thick with caution. "You sure you want to get tangled up with them?" "I don't have a choice," Abigail replied, her voice firm. "They're coming for me. And for my husband." Jack studied her for a long moment, the weight of the decision hanging between them. Then, with a resigned sigh, he leaned in closer. "The syndicate doesn't just come for people," he said in a hushed tone. "They're methodical. They don't do anything without reason. If they've set their sights on your husband, you best believe it's because of something he did, or something he's got. You know who they are, right?" Abigail nodded. "Outlaws. Criminals. But they're more than that. They run everything. Banks, trains, even the law around here. Nobody stands a chance against them." Jack grunted, taking a long drink from his glass. "That's the truth of it. They're a law unto themselves, and the men they've got working for them are the worst kind of scum. I've seen things, Abigail. Things you wouldn't believe. They don't just steal from you, they take your life, your soul, piece by piece, until there's nothing left." The words hit her like a punch to the gut. It wasn't enough that the syndicate controlled everything, it wasn't just about power. It was about destruction. Complete, utter destruction. They left nothing in their wake except broken men and women, hollowed out by fear. "How do we fight them?" she asked, her voice trembling despite herself. "How do we survive this?" Jack took another slow sip from his glass, eyes focused on something far away. "Survival? That's the easy part, sweetheart. Surviving's about hiding. You keep your head low, don't make any waves, and hope they don't come knocking on your door." He paused, as if reconsidering. "But if you want revenge, if you want to take them down? Well, that's a different game altogether." Abigail's heart raced. "Revenge?" she asked, her voice barely audible. "You're talking about fighting back?" Jack looked at her for the first time with a flicker of something that almost looked like respect. "If you want revenge, you've got to be willing to sacrifice everything. You can't take them on with a gun and a dream. You need to understand their game. You need to know how they think, how they move, and most importantly, who's on the inside." "Inside?" Abigail repeated, confused. "What do you mean? You're telling me there are people working for them who don't want to?" Jack's eyes darkened. "You're not the first to try to take them down, Abigail. But you're asking the right questions. The syndicate's got men everywhere. Not all of them are loyal by choice. Some of them want out, some of them are looking for a way to take the whole thing down from the inside. But it's dangerous, and you need to know who you can trust. There's only one person who might be able to help you, and I wouldn't trust anyone else in this town with that kind of information." Abigail felt her pulse quicken. "Who? Who can help us?" Jack hesitated, his gaze darting over his shoulder as if checking for eavesdroppers. "There's a man. A former Blackthorn enforcer. Goes by the name of Donovan. Used to run with the syndicate before they turned on him. He's out there somewhere, hiding. But if you want answers, you'll find him first." Abigail's mind was racing. A former enforcer? If anyone knew the syndicate's inner workings, it would be him. But how could she find someone who had gone into hiding, who might not even want to be found? She looked Jack dead in the eye, her voice steady. "Where do I find him?" Jack's lips curled into a grim smile. "That's the question, isn't it?" And with that, the conversation ended, leaving Abigail with more questions than answers, and the feeling that this was only the beginning. Abigail left the saloon feeling like a different person, like she had crossed a threshold from which there was no turning back. Jack's words echoed in her mind, and the weight of them pressed heavily against her chest. Donovan. He was the key. The man who could give them the inside knowledge they needed to stand a chance against the Blackthorn Syndicate. But he was out there, hiding in the shadows, and finding him would be like searching for a needle in a haystack. She couldn't afford to waste time. The Syndicate wasn't known for being patient. If they hadn't already come for Thomas, they were sure to soon. The very idea of it twisted her stomach, and her pulse quickened with fear and determination. If there was even the slightest chance they could fight back, she had to take it. But the thought of tracking down a man who might not even want to be found, it filled her with a sense of dread. What if Cole Donovan didn't want to help them? What if he had his own reasons for staying hidden? And what if he didn't trust her? There were so many unknowns, so many potential dangers lurking in the shadows. She had to take every step carefully. As she made her way back to the ranch, the landscape seemed darker, the world closing in around her with every passing minute. The wind whipped through the dry grasses, and Abigail couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. Her instincts told her she wasn't alone, but when she spun around, the empty stretch of land behind her was desolate. No one. Just the vast, unforgiving stretch of wilderness. Yet the unease lingered, gnawing at the edges of her mind. Back at the ranch, Thomas was waiting for her, his face a mix of concern and confusion as he took in the look on her face. "Abigail? What happened? What did Jack tell you?" She didn't have the heart to explain everything, not yet. But she couldn't hide the urgency in her eyes. "I know how we can fight them, Thomas," she said, her voice low but determined. "There's a man. He used to work for the Syndicate. His name is Cole Donovan. He's the one who can help us." Thomas frowned. "An ex-enforcer? That doesn't sound like someone we want to be involved with. You don't know what kind of man he is now." "I know," Abigail replied, her tone firm. "But he's the only one who knows how the Syndicate operates from the inside. Without him, we're dead in the water." The silence that followed was heavy, Thomas clearly torn between his instincts and the desperate need to take action. Finally, after a long pause, he nodded. "All right. Let's find him." They spent the next few days following every lead they could. They spoke to anyone who might know something, old acquaintances, travelers passing through, even a few of the less savory types in town. No one knew where Cole Donovan was hiding, but the more they searched, the more Abigail felt the walls closing in. Every conversation felt like a potential trap, every glance seemed to carry hidden meaning. It was as if the very town was a web of secrets, all spun by the Syndicate. Abigail's gut told her they were getting closer, though. She could feel it in the way people avoided her eyes, the way whispers fell silent when she entered a room. It wasn't long before she heard something, a name, a place, spoken in hushed tones by a man who had won too many drinks and was willing to speak a little too freely. A small, abandoned cabin just on the edge of town. That was where Cole Donovan had been spotted last. They didn't waste any time. The sun was already setting as they made their way toward the cabin, the orange and red hues of dusk casting long shadows across the land. The air was thick with tension, each step toward the cabin bringing them closer to the unknown. Abigail's heart pounded in her chest, her thoughts racing with questions. Was this the right decision? Would Cole Donovan be their ally, or was he just another piece of the Syndicate's puzzle? As they neared the cabin, a chill ran down her spine. The place was isolated, hidden away behind a wall of thick trees. No light shone from the windows, no signs of life. It was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that made her feel like they were walking into a trap. But they had no choice. They had come too far to turn back now. Thomas glanced over at her, his expression unreadable. "Stay close," he murmured, and she nodded in response. They crept toward the cabin, moving slowly, quietly, trying to avoid making any noise that could alert whoever was inside. The door was slightly ajar, the creaking of the old wood barely audible over the rustling of the wind. Abigail's heart skipped a beat as they pushed the door open just enough to peer inside. The cabin was dark, but she could make out the shape of a figure sitting in the corner. He was motionless, as if waiting for them. And then, just as they were about to step fully inside, a voice cut through the silence. "You're looking for me, aren't you?" Abigail froze. The voice was low and rough, but there was something familiar about it, something that made her blood run cold. She didn't recognize the man sitting in the corner, but she knew instinctively that this was Donovan. And he had been waiting for them. Before she could say anything, Cole stood up slowly, his movements deliberate, and the light from the doorway caught the edge of a rifle slung across his back. "You've been asking the right questions," he continued, his gaze never leaving them. "But answers come at a cost." Thomas stepped forward, his eyes narrowing. "We don't have time for games, Donovan. We need help. The syndicate's coming for us, and we don't have the luxury of waiting." Cole gave a short, humorless laugh. "Ain't no one's got time for anything when the syndicate's involved. But that's exactly why you should have stayed away from me. I'm not the kind of man you want as a friend." Abigail's pulse quickened. They had come this far, but now, standing before this man, she was struck with the cold realization that they might have walked straight into the heart of something darker than they could have imagined. Was Cole truly an ally, or had they just found themselves face to face with another dangerous player in this deadly game? She didn't know, but she was certain of one thing: the answers they needed were within reach, but at what cost? The tension in the room was suffocating. Abigail stood frozen, her eyes locked on Donovan, who now seemed less like the answer to their prayers and more like the embodiment of everything they had feared. The rifle slung across his back was a silent reminder of how quickly things could go wrong. Thomas's hand hovered near his own gun, but he didn't make a move. He could sense the danger in the air, the way Cole's presence seemed to command the room. The man wasn't just a former enforcer for the syndicate, he was someone who had survived by doing whatever it took, and that kind of survival made him unpredictable. Abigail's voice broke the silence, cutting through the thick air like a blade. "We didn't come here for trouble. We just need help. The syndicate, they've already set their sights on us. If we don't do something, it's only a matter of time before they come for us." She swallowed hard, trying to suppress the fear creeping up her spine. "We don't want to fight them, we want to stop them. You're the only one who can help us." Cole didn't speak immediately. His eyes narrowed as he studied her, measuring every word, every gesture. He looked like a man who had seen too much, done too much, and wasn't in the habit of trusting anyone. But then, slowly, he spoke again, his voice low and dangerous. "You don't understand what you're asking for," he said, his tone almost a growl. "The syndicate doesn't let people walk away. You can't just waltz in, guns blazing, expecting them to fold. These people, these men, they're more than outlaws. They're a machine, a network that's built on blood, lies, and betrayal. If you want to take them down, you need to be prepared to lose everything." Abigail's heart clenched at his words. She had known it wouldn't be easy, but she hadn't fully grasped the depth of the battle they were about to face. Everything she had believed about justice, about standing up for what was right, was suddenly shattered. But there was no turning back. Not now. Thomas spoke up, his voice steady, but the edge of urgency clear. "We're not asking for a war, Donovan. We're asking for information. We need to know how they work, how they think. You were inside. You must know something, anything that can give us a chance to escape this." Cole let out a long sigh, running a hand over his stubbled chin. The silence stretched on, thick with the weight of his decision. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he spoke again. "All right. I'll help you. But understand this is a one-way road. You can't turn back once you step in. The syndicate has eyes everywhere. If you even try to go after them, they'll make sure you don't get far. You'll be hunted, and they won't stop until you're dead. Abigail could feel the weight of his words like a physical blow. The price of their mission wasn't just their lives, it was everything they had ever known. There was no guarantee that they would succeed, no promise of a happy ending. But as Cole's eyes met hers, she saw something more in them, an understanding, a recognition of the desperate fight that she and Thomas were about to begin. "Then we'll do whatever it takes," she said, her voice unwavering despite the fear tightening in her chest. "We don't have a choice. If we don't stop them, they'll destroy everything we care about." Cole took a long, steady breath. "You'll need to be smart about this. The syndicate has a hand in every corner of this land, lawmen, businessmen, even some of the biggest ranchers around here. But the heart of it all? That's where you need to strike. If you can get close enough to the syndicate's leadership, you might have a chance." Abigail's mind was racing, trying to piece together the puzzle that had been laid before her. She had no illusions about what she was about to undertake. The syndicate was vast, their reach terrifying. But Cole had been right, this wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about fighting back, about showing them that they couldn't take everything without consequences. "What's the plan?" Thomas asked, his voice low but determined. Cole's gaze flicked to the door, as if checking to make sure they weren't being watched. "First, you need to understand who you're dealing with. The syndicate's not just a bunch of men on horseback, robbing trains and terrorizing towns. No, they've got a network, a web of people who feed them information, who keep their operations running. And that's where you'll find your leverage." Abigail's brow furrowed. "Leverage? What do you mean?" "You need to find the weak spots," Cole continued, his voice low but firm. "The syndicate's power isn't just in their guns or their money, it's in their control over people. If you can get to those who are close to them, the ones who know their secrets, you might be able to break their hold." "And where do we start?" Thomas asked. Cole paused, his eyes hardening. "There's a man who works for them, a spy. His name is Victor Darnell. He's the one who runs their intelligence operations, keeps tabs on anyone who might be a threat. He's got more information than anyone else, and he's slippery. But if you can find him, he might be your best shot at getting inside." Abigail felt a chill at the mention of Darnell's name. The man was a shadow, a ghost in the syndicate's network. To get to him would be dangerous, probably more dangerous than anything they had faced so far. But the more she thought about it, the more it made sense. If they could gain access to Darnell's network, they would have the keys to the syndicate's empire. But she also knew that finding him would be no easy task. The syndicate didn't leave loose ends, and Darnell would be no exception. He would be protected, hidden away behind layers of secrecy, ready to vanish at the first sign of danger. As if reading her mind, Cole added, "You'll need to move fast. The longer you stay in one place, the more chances they'll have to find you. You won't be able to stay hidden for long." Abigail nodded, her mind already spinning with plans and contingencies. She wasn't sure how they were going to pull this off, but she couldn't ignore the sense of urgency that was building inside her. They were getting closer, piece by piece, but the closer they got, the more dangerous it became. Every choice, every move, could be their last. And deep down, Abigail knew that the syndicate would stop at nothing to erase them, just as they had done to so many others. But she wasn't about to let them win. Not now, not after everything they had fought for. The next move was theirs, and it would be the most dangerous one yet. But no matter what happened, there was no going back. The fight had already begun. The plan had seemed simple enough in theory. Find Victor Darnell, extract the information they needed, and use it to dismantle the syndicate from the inside. But as Abigail and Thomas set out to put Cole's advice into motion, they quickly realized that simple wasn't a word that applied to the world they had just stepped into. They'd been in the saddle for days, following the thin trail Cole had given them, but no matter where they looked, they couldn't seem to get any closer to Darnell. The town he was supposed to be hiding in was small, too small to hide a man of his reputation for long. Still, they pressed on, day after day, each hour spent feeling more like a slow descent into something darker and more dangerous. Abigail was growing restless. Every passing moment felt like a risk, like they were walking on a tightrope, one slip away from falling into the abyss. She had never been this close to the heart of the syndicate's operations before, and the weight of it was pressing on her chest like a vice. What they were attempting wasn't just dangerous, it was insane. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows over the barren landscape, they reached a small, run-down cabin. It wasn't much, barely more than a shack, but it was secluded, nestled between thick trees, the kind of place someone would hide if they were trying to stay off the grid. Abigail's gut tightened as they approached the door, her hand instinctively drifting toward the revolver holstered at her side. "Do you think this is it?" Thomas asked, his voice low but filled with uncertainty. Abigail didn't answer immediately. She wasn't sure what they would find inside, she wasn't sure what they should be expecting. They had followed the signs, the rumors, the whispers in the dark corners of towns, but it didn't feel like they were any closer to their goal. The silence surrounding them seemed to echo louder than any words. Taking a deep breath, Abigail nodded. "We have to be ready for anything." With a steady hand, she pushed the door open, the creak of the hinges loud in the stillness of the evening. Inside, it was dim, with just the faintest light filtering through cracked windows. She couldn't make out any shapes, but there was a sense of movement, something was alive inside. Before she could take another step, a figure emerged from the shadows. A tall man, his face obscured by a wide-brimmed hat. He didn't speak, just watched them with eyes that gleamed unnervingly from the darkness. "Looking for someone?" the man asked, his voice gravelly but not unfriendly. There was an air of confidence about him, the kind that made Abigail instinctively reach for her gun again, though she kept her hand steady. "We're looking for Victor Darnell," Thomas said, his tone firm but cautious. The man didn't flinch. Instead, he slowly took a step forward, the light catching the glint of a silver badge on his chest. Abigail froze, her heart skipping a beat. "Darnell's not the man you're after," the stranger said, his lips curling into a knowing smile. "But you're getting closer. The question is, do you know what you're really walking into?" A chill swept over Abigail. The badge, why would a man like him be wearing it? She hadn't seen anything like it since. "No," she whispered, the realization striking her like a bolt of lightning. "You're with them." The man didn't need to confirm it. The way he stood, the way he carried himself, the hint of coldness in his eyes, he didn't need to say anything for Abigail to know the truth. This was no ordinary lawman. This was a syndicate enforcer, someone who had woven themselves so deeply into the fabric of this town that they were untouchable. And they had just walked straight into his trap. For a moment, everything seemed to slow down. The air was thick with tension, the sound of Abigail's heartbeat pounding in her ears. The man stepped closer, his smile never faltering. "You've been asking the right questions. But you've made a mistake. And mistakes, well, they have consequences." Thomas tensed, his hand moving instinctively toward his revolver, but Abigail held up a hand. There was something off about this. Something wasn't right. She had been so focused on finding Darnell, on uncovering the secrets of the syndicate, that she hadn't seen the bigger picture. "Who are you?" she demanded, her voice steady despite the rising panic inside her. The man's smile deepened. "I'm someone who's been watching you. Someone who's been keeping an eye on your little hunt. And believe me, you don't want to be on the other side of this. It hit her then. The reason they hadn't been able to find Darnell, it wasn't because they were looking in the wrong places. It was because they had been fed false information. Someone had been guiding them, pushing them toward dead ends, feeding them lies. The very idea that they were walking right into a trap, it was a twist they hadn't expected. The man took another step forward, his hand moving slowly to a pistol at his side. You want Darnell, you say? Too bad. He's already dead. Abigail's blood ran cold at the words. Dead? If Darnell was dead, what did that mean for their entire mission? What other plans had the syndicate set in motion while they had been chasing shadows? The man's grin widened. It was always going to end like this, you know. You should have stayed away. Before Abigail could respond, the sound of hooves echoed in the distance. It wasn't just one rider. There were several. They were surrounded. The realization hit her like a punch in the gut. They had walked into a trap so expertly set, they hadn't even seen it coming. The syndicate had known they were coming for Darnell. They had been led here on purpose, bait for a much larger, deadlier game. And now, Abigail knew, they were trapped in a web with no way out. As the sound of horses grew louder, the man in front of them didn't flinch. He simply gave a small nod, and that was when Abigail saw it. The unmistakable signs of reinforcements closing in on them, men who had been waiting for them to make their move. It wasn't just Darnell they had been after, it was something much bigger. She turned to Thomas, her heart racing. We need to get out of here. Now. But the men were closing in. There was no way out. The trap had been sprung. And the only thing Abigail could do now was brace herself for what was to come. The game had changed. And everything she thought she knew about the syndicate, about who they could trust, was about to be shattered beyond repair. Abigail's heart was pounding in her chest as she and Thomas backed into the cabin, their eyes scanning the men surrounding them. The sound of hooves had grown deafening, and the oppressive silence of the moment felt like a countdown to an inevitable confrontation. She could feel the weight of the rifle pressing against her shoulder, but there was no easy way out. No escape. The man who had led them here, a syndicate enforcer, smirked, clearly enjoying the moment. His voice was cold, calculating. You really thought you could outsmart us? You've been playing a dangerous game, and now the syndicate's patience has run out. Abigail swallowed, her fingers tightening on her revolver. She wasn't going down without a fight, not when everything had come this far. She glanced at Thomas, his expression hardening as he readied his own gun. They had faced danger before, but this felt different. They were outnumbered, trapped, and the stakes had never been higher. But then, as if the world itself was holding its breath, a new sound broke the tension. A lone shot rang out in the distance, the crack of a rifle echoing across the barren landscape. The syndicate enforcer's smirk faltered, and for the first time, doubt flickered in his eyes. Get down! Abigail shouted, shoving Thomas out of the way just as another shot rang out. This time, it wasn't aimed at them. It was aimed at the men closing in on them. A figure appeared from the shadows, silhouetted against the twilight sky. The unmistakable form of Donovan, his rifle raised high, his cold eyes scanning the scene with a predator's precision. You've made a mistake, he called out to the syndicate enforcers, his voice carrying across the stillness of the moment. This is my territory. In that instant, everything shifted. The syndicate's enforcers hesitated, confusion rippling through their ranks. It was clear they hadn't anticipated Cole's involvement. For a moment, it was as if the world had stopped spinning. And then, chaos erupted. The sound of gunfire filled the air as Abigail and Thomas sprang into action, their bodies moving almost instinctively. Shots rang out from all sides, but they weren't the ones being targeted. The syndicate men, caught off guard by Cole's sudden intervention, were scrambling for cover. Abigail's pulse raced as she took a steadying breath, her hands trembling slightly as she aimed her revolver at one of the enforcers. The man's eyes widened in surprise as she pulled the trigger, sending him crashing to the ground in a cloud of dust. Thomas, never one to hesitate, was right by her side, firing with precision. It was a blur of motion, each shot landing with lethal intent. The odds were still stacked against them, but with Cole's help, they had a fighting chance. The syndicate's enforcers were falling back, retreating into the trees, their plan unraveling before their eyes. Abigail could feel the weight of every second. She wasn't sure how much longer they could hold their ground. The syndicate wasn't known for backing down easily, and they had undoubtedly sent reinforcements to deal with this. But for now, they were winning. For now, they had the upper hand. As the last of the syndicate men retreated, Abigail caught a glimpse of Cole, his rifle now lowered. His face was as unreadable as ever, but there was a glint of something almost imperceptible, in his eyes. He turned to her and Thomas, a silent acknowledgement passing between them. But just as quickly, his expression hardened. "This isn't over," he said, his voice grim. "The syndicate will be back, and they won't stop until they've destroyed everything you've worked for." Abigail nodded, her breath coming in ragged gasps. "We know. But at least now we have a chance." Thomas wiped sweat from his brow and gave a short laugh. "A chance is all we need." Cole's gaze flicked toward the horizon, his mind already working through their next steps. "I'll help you, but we need to move fast. There's no time to waste." As the last of the daylight faded, the three of them, Abigail, Thomas, and Cole, made their way through the trees, deeper into the wilderness. They knew that the syndicate's wrath was far from finished. The danger had only escalated, and the stakes were higher than ever before. But there was a sense of resolve in the air now, a determination to keep fighting, no matter what it took. But as they moved silently through the underbrush, Abigail felt a strange chill creep down her spine. It wasn't the usual fear that accompanied danger, it was something different, something far more unsettling. She looked at Cole, who had fallen into step beside them, his eyes scanning the surroundings. Something wasn't right. She turned to Thomas, her voice barely a whisper. "Did you see it? Did you feel that?" He glanced at her, his brows furrowed. "What do you mean?" Abigail didn't answer, her instincts screaming that something was wrong. They had narrowly escaped one trap, but this didn't feel like the end. And as they continued through the trees, Abigail's suspicions grew. And then, just as they reached the edge of the clearing, the truth hit her. The sound of horses galloping fast, the unmistakable echoes of men shouting commands. Reinforcements. But not from the syndicate. It was Cole's men. She turned to him, her heart sinking as she realized the full extent of the situation. Cole hadn't just been helping them. He had been leading them. Leading them straight into a trap, just as the syndicate had intended. The truth crashed down on her with brutal force. Cole Donovan had never been on their side. He had been playing both sides all along. Before she could react, a voice behind her called out. "You didn't think we'd let you get away that easily, did you?" Cole's smirk was the last thing she saw before everything went black. Abigail's world spun as the weight of the truth crashed down on her. The shock of Cole's betrayal hit harder than any bullet ever could. She had trusted him, fought beside him, and he had played them all from the start. She tried to move, to make sense of the betrayal, but her body felt numb, as though the ground beneath her was pulling her down into a pit of uncertainty. As her vision blurred, the last thing she saw was Cole's cold, calculating eyes, and the sound of horses closing in, the metallic clink of weapons being readied, and the sharp laughter of men who had been waiting for this moment all along. When Abigail woke, it was to a dull, aching pain in her head. Her eyes fluttered open, and she realized she was lying on cold, hard ground. The moonlight filtered through the trees above, casting long shadows that made the woods seem even more oppressive. She groaned, trying to move, only to find that her hands were bound tightly behind her. The harsh ropes dug into her wrists, and for a moment, she thought the darkness might swallow her whole again. But then, she heard voices. Low, murmured voices. Familiar voices. Abigail? Thomas's voice, rough with worry, called out in the distance. Abigail, you okay? Abigail tried to call back, but her throat felt like sandpaper. She coughed, then whispered, Thomas. I'm here. Moments later, she heard him moving through the brush, followed by the sound of someone cutting the ropes around her wrists. Thomas appeared in her line of sight, his face etched with concern. His hands trembled slightly as he freed her, and his eyes never left hers. Are you hurt? He asked softly, his voice full of relief and fear. She shook her head, wincing slightly at the pain in her temples. No. Just a little disoriented. But? Thomas, we've been set up. I know, he said, his voice tight. I heard Cole talking to his men. He was never on our side. He's been using us from the start. He's working for the syndicate, playing both sides to keep his position secure. Abigail felt her heart drop. She had known something wasn't right, but to hear it out loud, to know that Cole had been manipulating them all along, it made the betrayal sting all the more. They both stood in silence for a moment, the weight of their situation hanging heavily in the air. Abigail glanced around, her mind racing. They had to get out of here. They couldn't stay in the woods forever. Where's Cole? She finally asked, her voice cold with the edge of betrayal. Thomas's face hardened. He left with his men. They're taking us to a hidden camp. They're not going to kill us, not yet, anyway. They want us alive, for now. He's probably planning something else, something bigger. Abigail didn't need to hear any more. She didn't need to be told twice that they had to get away, that escaping was their only option. If they stayed here, they were as good as dead. We can't stay here, she said urgently. We need to move. Without waiting for a response, Abigail started to push herself to her feet, using a nearby tree for support. Her head swam slightly, but she ignored it. Thomas was already ahead of her, looking around the woods for any sign of danger. Can you walk? He asked, glancing back. I'll be fine, Abigail replied, determination lacing her voice. She wasn't going to let Cole's betrayal be the end of this. They moved quickly through the trees, staying low and silent, knowing they had to cover ground before Cole's men realized they had escaped. Every step felt like it could be their last, but Abigail was driven by the one thing that kept her going, the need to take down the syndicate once and for all. As they made their way deeper into the forest, Abigail couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching them. It wasn't just the paranoia of the situation, it was something more, something in the air that told her they weren't alone. She wasn't sure what it was, but she felt the tension rise in her chest. Thomas, she whispered, I think we're being followed. Thomas stopped, his head whipping around to scan the dark shadows of the trees. His hand instinctively went to his gun, his jaw clenched. I don't see anyone. Abigail didn't argue, but the feeling in her gut wouldn't go away. They had to keep moving, but she couldn't shake the sense of impending danger. She could feel the eyes on her, could almost hear the footsteps creeping closer. They were getting closer. Suddenly, a figure stepped out of the shadows, a familiar silhouette. Cole? Abigail's voice was barely above a whisper, the disbelief clear in her tone. Cole Donovan emerged from the darkness, his face impassive as always. But this time, there was no smug smile, no hint of the manipulator she had come to know. His eyes were cold, But there was something different in them, a sense of finality, like a decision had already been made. "You're not making it out of here alive," Cole said, his voice low but filled with certainty. "You had your chance. You should have stayed away." Abigail's heart sank. This was it. She had hoped, against hope, that maybe there was some chance to turn the tables, to outsmart him. But it was clear now, Cole had never intended to help them. He was part of the syndicate's game all along. Without warning, the sound of gunshots erupted from all sides. Men from the syndicate had appeared, surrounding them in the trees, ready to finish what they had started. But then something unexpected happened. Cole's face twisted with a flicker of irritation, and with a sharp motion, he turned to his men, barking orders to halt. The gunfire ceased immediately, and for a moment, it was eerily quiet. "You're not going to kill them," Cole said, his tone ice-cold but final. "Not yet. They're still useful." Abigail's mind raced. What was going on? Was Cole turning on them now? Or was there something else at play? In a split second, it became clear. The syndicate was unraveling. The power struggle had reached its boiling point. Cole wasn't in control anymore. There were factions within the syndicate, each vying for power. And now, they had underestimated Abigail and Thomas. Without warning, Abigail lunged forward, her gun drawn, and fired a single shot. It landed squarely on one of the men who had been approaching, taking him down instantly. Chaos erupted again. A firefight broke out, but this time, it was different. The syndicate's grip was slipping. Betrayals were exposed, and alliances were crumbling faster than they could be rebuilt. Abigail and Thomas fought with everything they had left, using the chaos as cover to make their way through the woods. They had no more time to waste. They had no more time to second-guess their decisions. As they reached the clearing and saw the open road ahead, Abigail could feel the weight of everything that had happened. The fight wasn't over. The syndicate was still out there. But for the first time in a long time, she felt the rush of possibility. "Let's finish this," she said, her voice steady. And as they disappeared into the night, the world around them still uncertain, they knew one thing for sure: this wasn't the end of their story. It was only the beginning.